there was a time when India was not one land, but 100, a shifting patchwork of rival kingdoms and warring tribes, of forest republics and jealous kings, scattered across a subcontinent so vast it seemed impossible that any single hand could ever hold it. For centuries, no one did. And then, in the space of a single lifetime, one man rose from obscurity, gathered these fragments together, and forged the first empire India had ever known. Within 2 generations, his dynasty ruled from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of the south, over tens of millions of people, in cities so grand that foreign ambassadors wrote of them in astonishment. This was the Maurya Empire, and at its height, it produced a king who did something almost no conqueror in history has ever done. After winning the bloodiest war of his age, after slaughtering 100,000 people to seize a single province, he stopped. He laid down his sword forever and spent the rest of his life trying to atone. His name was Ashoka, and to understand how a warlord became one of the gentlest rulers the world has ever seen, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a moment when a foreign army stood on India's doorstep, and the old world was about to end. The year is around 326 before our era. In the far northwest, along the banks of the Indus, the soldiers of Alexander the Great have marched further east than any Greek before them. They have conquered Persia, crossed the mountains, and now they stand at the edge of India itself. But here, at last, Alexander's exhausted army refuses to go further. They turn back, and in the power vacuum left behind, in the shadow of that retreating Greek army, a young man is watching and learning. His name is Chandragupta Maurya. We know little of his origins for certain, and later legends dress him in mystery, some calling him lowborn, some royal. But we know what he did next. Guided by a brilliant and ruthless advisor, a Brahmin strategist remembered as Chanakya or Kautilya, Chandragupta set out to do the unthinkable. He would overthrow the mightiest kingdom in India and build something entirely new in its place. That kingdom was Magadha, ruled by the powerful and deeply unpopular Nanda dynasty from their great capital in the east. The Nandas commanded an enormous army and vast wealth, but they were hated by their own people. Chanakya, according to tradition, had been humiliated by the Nanda king, and he made a vow to destroy him. In Chandragupta he found his weapon. Together, master strategist and young commander, they raised an army from the frontier and turned it against the heart of India. It was not quick and it was not easy, but in the end, the Nanda dynasty fell, and around 321 before our era, Chandragupta Maurya took the throne of Magadha. The empire had been born. The mind behind much of this was Chanakya, and his legacy was not only an empire, but a book. Tradition credits him with the Arthashastra, an ancient treatise on statecraft so cold and clear-eyed that readers still compare it to the works of Machiavelli, written nearly 2,000 years earlier. It is a manual for how to hold power, and it hides nothing. It describes taxation and law, agriculture and diplomacy, but also a vast web of informers and secret agents, spies disguised as monks and merchants and beggars, watching the ministers, the provinces, even the king's own family. Whether or not Chandragupta ruled exactly by its pages, The Arthashastra reveals the machinery of the world he built, an empire held together not by faith or affection, but by administration, intelligence, and iron discipline. It is the blueprint of a state that intended to endure. Now imagine standing before its capital, Pataliputra, near the modern city of Patna, at the height of Chandragupta's power. It was, quite simply, one of the greatest cities on earth. We are not guessing at this. A Greek ambassador named Megasthenes came to live at Chandragupta's court, sent by one of Alexander's successors, and he wrote an account of what he saw. The city, he reported, stretched for miles along the river, protected by a massive timber wall with hundreds of towers and dozens of gates, surrounded by a deep moat. Inside lived a teeming population, governed by an administration of remarkable sophistication. There were boards of officials to manage trade, to care for foreigners, to register births and deaths, to oversee the markets and the vast irrigation works. This was not a loose collection of tribes. This was a state with taxes and spies and roads, and a standing army that numbered, by ancient accounts, in the hundreds of thousands, complete with war elephants that terrified every enemy who faced them. And those elephants would soon change the map of the world. Around 305 before our era, Chandragupta came face to face with the successors of Alexander himself. Seleucus, one of Alexander's greatest generals, now ruled a huge empire stretching from the Mediterranean toward India, and he marched east to reclaim the lands the Greeks believed were theirs. He met Chandragupta, and Chandragupta won. The details of the war are lost, but its outcome is clear from the treaty that followed. Seleucus ceded vast territories in the northwest, in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, to the Maurya Empire. In return, Chandragupta gave him a gift of extraordinary military value: 500 war elephants. Those elephants would later help Seleucus win a decisive battle far to the west. And so the beasts of India helped shape the wars of the Greek world, while an Indian emperor now ruled from the Bay of Bengal to the borders of Persia. But here the story takes its first strange turn. Chandragupta, the man who had conquered an empire, walked away from it. According to a strong and ancient Jain tradition, late in his life, the emperor embraced Jainism, a faith of radical nonviolence and renunciation. He gave up his throne, handed power to his son, and traveled far, to the south, to a hill, at a place called Shravanabelagola in modern Karnataka. There, the tradition says, this once mighty conqueror chose to end his life in the most extreme act of Jain devotion, slowly fasting to death in a ritual of complete detachment from the world. Whether every detail is literal history or sacred memory, the shape of the story is remarkable. The founder of India's first empire renounced everything he had built. It is the first hint of a theme that would define this dynasty: the strange and powerful pull between absolute worldly power and the desire to give it all away. Power passed to Chandragupta's son, Bindusara, who ruled for around 25 years and pushed the empire's borders even further, driving Maurya control deep into the south of the peninsula. He is a shadowy figure, less celebrated than his father or his son, but under him the empire matured and grew until it covered almost the entire subcontinent. And then, around 268 before our era, the throne passed to the grandson of Chandragupta, a prince who, in his early years, showed every sign of being a hard and ambitious man, a capable administrator, and a ruthless fighter for the throne. His name was Ashoka, and for the first part of his reign, he was exactly the kind of king the ancient world produced in abundance, expanding his power, crushing his rivals, hungry for glory, until he turned his armies toward a land on the eastern coast called Kalinga. Kalinga, in what is now the state of Odisha, was a proud and independent kingdom that had resisted Maurya control. Around the year 261 before our era, Ashoka invaded it. The war that followed was, by the emperor's own account, a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. And here is where the story becomes something rare in ancient history, because we do not have to rely on legend or on the boasts of court poets. We have Ashoka's own words. After the conquest, Ashoka did something no ruler before him had done in quite this way. He had his thoughts carved into rock and stone pillars across his empire, edicts written in the everyday language of his people, in a script we can still read today. And on the subject of Kalinga, those edicts do not boast. They grieve. In them, the emperor records that 100,000 people were killed in the fighting, that 150,000 were carried away as captives, and that many times that number perished in the aftermath. And then he says something astonishing for a victorious king. He says that he is filled with deep sorrow and regret, that the suffering he caused weighs upon his conscience, that the slaughter of Kalinga has broken something inside him. Try for a moment to stand where he stood. The fighting is over. The proud kingdom of Kalinga has fallen exactly as he intended. But the price is spread across the fields in front of him, in the smoke rising from burned villages, in the long lines of the captured being led away from everything they knew, in the silence where a living kingdom stood only weeks before. This is victory. This is the thing he came for. And looking at it, the emperor feels not triumph, but something he has no name for, a horror that will not leave him. The most successful day of his reign becomes the day his old life ends. Think about what this means. Standing on the battlefield of his greatest victory, surrounded by the corpses of 100,000 people, the most powerful man in the world looked at what he had done and was horrified by it. And instead of moving on to the next conquest, as every conqueror before him had, Ashoka stopped. He renounced war. He turned, in his grief, toward the teachings of the Buddha, whose message of compassion and nonviolence had been spreading through India for 2 centuries. And he set out to rule by an entirely different principle, one he called Dhamma, a code of moral duty, of tolerance, of kindness toward all living things. This was not a private, quiet conversion. Ashoka rebuilt his entire idea of what an empire was for. He declared that true conquest was not conquest by the sword, but conquest by Dhamma, by winning hearts through righteousness. Across his vast realm, from Afghanistan to southern India, he had edicts inscribed on great polished stone pillars and on the faces of rocks and cave walls, so that his people and we could read the mind of an emperor. He urged kindness to servants and the poor. He called for respect between different religions, insisting that one should honor the faith of others, rather than glorify one's own. He established what may be among the earliest recorded measures of public welfare, ordering the planting of shade trees and the digging of wells along the roads, and the provision of medical care, he claimed, for both people and animals. He softened harsh punishments. He gave up the royal hunt, and he sent emissaries far beyond his borders, carrying the message of the Buddha to distant lands. It is here that Ashoka changed the history of the world, far beyond India. He sent Buddhist missionaries out in every direction, to the Greek kingdoms of the West and, most consequentially, to the island of Sri Lanka, where tradition holds that his own son, Mahinda, brought the teachings that would take root and endure there for more than 2,000 years. Before Ashoka, Buddhism was one of many faiths within India. After him, it was on its way to becoming one of the great religions of Asia and the world. A single emperor's grief on a single battlefield helped send a philosophy of peace across the entire continent. And the pillars themselves were wonders. Each was cut from a single enormous block of sandstone, some standing over 40 feet tall and weighing many tons, quarried in the north, and somehow transported hundreds of miles across the empire to be raised in distant places. Their surfaces were worked to a mirror-bright polish, so fine that people who saw them centuries later refused to believe they were made of stone at all, crowned with sculpted lions and bulls and wheels. They were not monuments to conquest or to the emperor's own glory. They were monuments to an idea. In an age when kings built to be feared, Ashoka built to be understood. And there is a beautiful irony hidden in all of this. Remember that other great Indian civilization, the people of the Indus, whose writing we still cannot read, who left us cities, but never a single word we can understand. Ashoka is almost their opposite. Through his edicts, carved in living stone, he becomes the first ruler in Indian history whose actual voice we can hear across the centuries, his doubts, his sorrows, his hopes, spoken directly to us. Where the Indus is silence, Ashoka is a voice, and that voice belongs not to a conqueror celebrating his victories, but to a broken man trying to become a better one. Yet even the greatest empires are mortal. After Ashoka's death, around 232 before our era, the Maurya Empire began to fade. His successors lacked his vision and his grip. The immense territory held together by roads and administration, and the sheer force of a few extraordinary personalities began to fracture along its old regional lines. Provinces drifted away. The economy strained under the cost of ruling so much land. And roughly 50 years after Ashoka, the empire came to a quiet and violent end. The last Maurya emperor, a man named Brihadratha, was assassinated by his own commander-in-chief, a general who then seized the throne and founded a new dynasty. The first great empire of India, forged by Chandragupta and perfected by Ashoka, was gone less than a century and a half after it began. But the Maurya Empire never truly disappeared, because its greatest achievement was never really the land it held. It was an idea, the idea that this vast and dazzlingly diverse subcontinent could be one, that a single vision of order and justice could stretch from sea to mountain, and it left behind symbols that would outlast every stone of Pataliputra. Atop one of Ashoka's greatest pillars, at Sarnath, where the Buddha first taught, stood a magnificent sculpture of 4 lions, seated back to back, facing the 4 directions, carved with breathtaking skill more than 2,000 years ago, when India became a free and independent nation in the 20th century. It chose that ancient sculpture, the lion capital of Ashoka, as its national emblem. And the wheel that sits beneath those lions, the wheel of Dhamma, the wheel of righteous law, was placed at the very center of the Indian flag, where it turns to this day. So consider, at the last, the strange arc of this story. A fractured land, united by an unknown young man and his ruthless teacher. An empire won by elephants and armies, and then, twice over, renounced. A conqueror who murdered 100,000 people, and then spent the rest of his life carving pleas for peace into stone. The Maurya Empire lasted only a handful of generations, but it planted something in the soil of India that never died, a memory of unity, a philosophy of compassion, and the image of 4 lions still watching over the land. Empires rise and fall, but sometimes what an empire dreams outlives everything it builds. If you would like to keep traveling with us through the forgotten corners of the human past, stay a while longer, and let the next story begin.